Can everyone see the presentation, the starting slide all right?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, so thanks for coming today. We're going to be going through our Human Trafficking 101 training and all the things that entails, and talking a little bit about CATE, the coalition, and what we do. So to give a kind of brief overview, we're going to start by talking about how we talk about trafficking, how we see and understand it, and what effect that has. And then we're going to move into talking about some of the statistics and facts we do have about trafficking, how we get those, and what makes those sometimes hard to get. And then the last half or so of the presentation is going to be focused on identification of survivors, what to do if you identify a survivor, and then information for best practices for working with the survivor in a one-on-one level, as well as, as an organization, different things you can do on that level. There are going to be a couple points where I ask for some response to something I ask. You can, if you want, unmute yourself and go ahead and respond in those points, or if you would rather put something in the chat and have me read it off, we can do that as well. Last thing to note, after we're done here, I am going to be sending out a small evaluation, just asking, how I did, what worked, what you learned. And I'd ask that you please just take a few minutes to fill that out. That's good, not only so that we can, make this presentation the best it can be, but we also need those numbers for our reporting for grants and different things. So if you could just take a few minutes with that, I would appreciate that. All right, so we are CATE, the Missouri Coalition Against Trafficking and Exploitation. There is our website, www.mocate.org. We're a coalition of different organizations across Missouri that work with survivors of human trafficking, both individuals for whom that's their primary mission is to work with survivors and help survivors, as well as other groups like medical workers or domestic violence shelters who may not be their primary focus, but they may encounter survivors and need to work with survivors. Our mission is to create a united community movement to prevent and respond to human trafficking and exploitation, and our vision is for a community that's educated, aware, and supportive. We're housed at Healing Action, who is also one of our collaborative partners. Healing Action partners with survivors and the community to end commercial sexual exploitation. They do this through community awareness, client advocacy, and a comprehensive array of services. They serve adult survivors of commercial sexual exploitation of any variety. They start with things like peer support, service management, trauma therapy, and go on to focus on fostering things like recovery fellowship and encouraging survivor leadership in the anti-trafficking movement. They're also one of our 3 collaborative partners, who are agencies that work with survivors that help to guide the mission and the actions of the coalition. So we are, of course, going to be discussing some sensitive material today, some things that could be upsetting to people, some things that could be potentially triggering to people. So if at any point you feel that you need a moment, you need to step away from the screen, don't worry about us. Go ahead and take that time. So as I said, we're going to start a little bit by talking about how we talk about trafficking, the words we use, and how we understand human trafficking as a result of that. So sex trafficking, the legal definition would be any commercial sex act involving someone under the age of 18, or a commercial sex act involving adults that is induced through force, fraud, or coercion. As a quick exercise, could I ask, when you hear the word prostitution, or the word sex trafficking, those 2 words in kind of separate areas, what sort of images, ideas, definitions come to mind for you? Some things we typically get here, people talking about, definitions, prostitution being exchanging sex or sex acts for money, then sex trafficking, talking about how that is coerced or forced in that scenario. But when we start talking about kind of the images, yeah, so some Katie in the chat said teenage girls being sold to rich men, and that is, exactly what happens a lot of the time. We'll talk about, kind of the age demographics and how those split up. And while the majority of those experiencing sex trafficking are adults because there are more of them, most individuals who are involved in the life in some capacity were brought into it as children, did begin as teenagers. Another thing to kind of get to in this section is sort of the images we associate with trafficking and prostitution. So when we think of those things, we kind of tend to think of street prostitution, things that we see on like police shows on television, where it's a woman dressed kind of scantily clad on the side of the road who is soliciting men from their cars. And while that is something that prostitution looks like, and that is something that sex trafficking looks like, that sort of image being our primary understanding of what it is does get in the way of, a deeper understanding of all the forms it can take, especially in the age of the internet, where a lot of this is done through online transactions, escort services, and things like that. So we kind of want to take a minute to look at these archetypes that we associate with trafficking, with prostitution, and understand that that's not everything it looks like. And if we're only looking there, we are missing a part of the story. Labor trafficking is the use of force, fraud, or coercion to recruit, harbor, transport, obtain, or employ a person for labor or services in involuntary servitude, peonage, or debt bondage. And peonage and debt bondage there are both referring to making the individual pay off a debt. Often traffickers will use debt as a way to make people feel that they owe them something, and that's how they start that exploitation. That's how they bring them close to them. Some notable things with labor trafficking and kind of how we talk about it and understand it. It's often associated with sort of one of two types of work, types of labor, where we see, outdoor manual labor, things like agriculture, construction, these hard manual outdoor jobs. And then the other form that's kind of typically thought of would be in, factories, sweatshops that are, cramped, overworked, and the space is cramped to a point where it's actively unsafe for the people there. And when we talk about the different forms that labor trafficking can take, we'll actually see that that is sort of just one smaller, again, idea of what labor trafficking can look like. And that a lot of industries that utilize traffic labor actually involve interacting with and seeing people who don't know that this individual is being trafficked, who aren't part of the group that's in charge of them. And that adds onto the, physical labor that's already being done, emotional labor of keeping up appearances and presenting this as, a normal job that's being done. So to legally define trafficking and what that looks like if we were to prove it in a court of law, there are three parts. The process, means, and end. So what is being done: recruitment, transfer, harboring, receipt of a person. How it's done: through physical force, verbal coercion, or fraud, misrepresentation of the job, for the ends of exploitation of some kind. The major important thing to note here would be that in the case of child trafficking, to prove in a court of law that a child was trafficked, this middle column of force, fraud, and coercion does not need to be proven. That is assumed based on the fact that it was a child who was trafficked. So all that needs to be proven in those cases is that the process and the ends were done. If we're trying to prove a case of trafficking of an adult, that middle column then comes into play, and we need to prove that somewhere along the line those things happened. Some common terms, some of which we'll talk about a bit more in depth later, but they're all good to know. So pimp, boyfriend, daddy are all terms that traffickers will use to refer to themselves and tell their victims to refer to them by. And that does a couple things for them in their sort of system of control. First of all, terms like boyfriend and daddy do, you know, they warm that individual up to them. They're familial terms, they're comfortable, safe terms, and having them refer to them in that way is a way to try and convince them that this person is a protector, a friend, someone who is there for them. And additionally, when other people hear terms like boyfriend and daddy, they're not immediately, aware of what those terms mean. There are typical, everyday, normal ways that those words are used, so those words don't immediately alert people to what's going on. Turnout is to when a trafficker brings someone new into the trafficking situation, recruits someone new. The track is the physical space where the individuals work. So in the street prostitution example, that would be the street corner. A quota is a certain amount of money or a certain number of customers that an individual needs to meet with in a night for their trafficker. Seasoning and grooming are words that are being more commonly used and understood, but they're referring to recruitment tactics that are usually used on children um, to sort of normalize the behaviors around trafficking. So things like boyfriend and daddy are a part of that, where these, actions and attitudes that should be alarming are normalized to the child over time so they don't see them that way. We do see branding in survivors of trafficking where they will be marked with their trafficker's name or a symbol that their trafficker uses to represent themselves. Most of the time, this is done with tattoos, but it has been seen with literal branding with hot metal as well. A John is a customer, someone who buys sex and drives up that demand in the market. Bottom is one of the things we'll talk about a little bit more in depth later, but it is when a trafficker, as part of that system of control, gives one of the victims more control over the others and sort of sets them against one another to take up some of the work that the trafficker would otherwise be doing while keeping everyone in check and keeping everyone set against one another. And finally, stable, family, stability. This is how traffickers are presenting themselves to their victims. They want the people they are exploiting to understand them as a protector and a provider, someone who is giving them shelter and food and everything that they need. This framework here is called the spectrum of exploitation. This is just a framework that we like to use to visualize a couple things about sexual exploitation and how it works and how we understand it. So it views individuals on how much agency they have or how much control they have over their own choices. When they work, what Johns they accept to work with. Do they get all of the money they earn and have complete control over the money they earn? Things like that. So a person with complete agency, complete control over their work, we may hear terms like prostitution or sex work. As more control is placed on that individual, we may hear things like sexual exploitation. And ultimately, at complete victimization, we hear terms like sex trafficking. But the first important thing to note here is that these aren't clearly separated, defined terms. The circles are overlapping, they're the same color. So here on the framework, there's literally no clear distinction where one stops and the next one starts. Just going off of the words that someone uses to refer to themselves is not a good or useful way to understand where they might be on this framework. And secondly, maybe someone is, has a lot of control over themselves and is very far to the right side on this framework. That doesn't tell you about their past. It doesn't tell you about how they came into the life, how they survived in the life, and what they've gone through. And that is part of why Healing Action and a lot of our other organizations will work with anyone who is trying to leave the life, whether they can prove there then and there that they are being trafficked or were being trafficked, that they are being exploited in a way that's clearly visible, because you can't know anyone's history in the life and what brought them to where they are now. So some things that we tend to hear, some myths and ideas. So some people will say that trafficking is a crime that happens to children, that children are trafficked by individuals and adults are participating in prostitution or sex work of their own will. While it is true that all commercial sex involving a minor is legally human trafficking, that meets the definition. Adults are, made to provide commercial sex through force, fraud, and coercion, through people making them do these things, and that is human trafficking. There's another idea that most people are trafficked by strangers, people they don't know. We go again to sort of the archetype image of a kidnapper in a van taking a child off the street. And that just doesn't hold up to reality. We know that most survivors have been trafficked by romantic partners, including their spouses, or by family members, including their parents. And to look a bit on the breakdown on that, family members are involved in nearly half of child trafficking cases. Based on this study that we have on the side, it's coming in at around 41%. An intimate partner, someone that child views as a boyfriend or girlfriend, 14% of the time, a friend, 11% of the time, and other, 34%. An important thing to note with that other is that even in that case, it's still not mostly, strangers and kidnappings like we typically envision them. Often that is what I've heard referred to as the 3 Ls, someone that child likes, loves, or lives with. This may be someone from school, someone from church, someone that they still see and know in their day-to-day life. And the majority of children who are trafficked for sexual exploitation are aged 15 to 17. So of that smaller number of children who are trafficked by intimate partners, by boyfriends and girlfriends, 98% of those children do end up in situations of forced sexual exploitation. Nearly all of those are girls, coming in at 96%. Most commonly, though, we see intimate partners involved in the trafficking of adults, often their spouses, with 91% of trafficking for sexual exploitation overall involving intimate partners. Another idea that we hear often is that prostitution is a choice, that people chose this life, this work, and that's why they're doing it now. And that ignores quite a few realities. So first of all, that initially consenting either to commercial sex or to a labor setting before those acts of force, fraud, and coercion occur is not relevant to the crime. Once those things happen, that is still trafficking. One example from the world of labor trafficking that we've encountered is there was an agricultural job harvesting crops, and it was presented to the individuals working it as a legitimate job, as it had, pay, benefits, it was a live-in position. And so these people, applied and went to the job. And for the first 2 weeks in that position, that facade was kind of kept up. It was hard work, it was agricultural work, but they were allowed breaks, they worked more reasonable hours, and they were allowed the living space that had been acquired for them was very nice, very up to date, very safe. And then after that 2 weeks were up and these individuals really had nowhere to go, was when that fraud was revealed and they started to be coerced to do the job. They worked longer hours, weren't allowed breaks, had people with there forcing them to work. And their living space, talking about the way traffickers, place control on people and set people against one another. They were moved from that nicer living space to one that the building was damaged, falling apart in places. Not all of the rooms were fully furnished. There were not fully running utilities in the building. It was an actively dangerous place for people to be. And I believe it was 2 rooms of that nicer living space were kept on, and people who, kept up with their quota, did what the trafficker expected of them, were allowed to go and stay in that nicer space. We also commonly hear phrases like, they knew better, they knew what they were getting into, why did they go into the life if they knew what it entailed? And that, ignores a lot of the reason women, quote, choose prostitution in the first place. Often that choice is made out of a need for food, for shelter, for clothes for your kids, for basic necessities that individuals need. And the choice is between, entering the life, entering prostitution, or not getting those necessities in any way. So that idea that they knew better, that this was a choice they made, ignores a lot of the realities of why that choice was made. So now we are going to look a little bit at statistics and facts and what we have. So estimates in the United States for number of trafficked individuals will range anywhere between 5,000 and 25 million individuals. And that's a huge, huge disparity there, but numbers are difficult to generate for quite a few reasons. Trafficking itself is a criminal enterprise that makes it very difficult for researchers to gain access to anywhere they could get a more accurate count. And it makes it actively unsafe for us to ask survivors to try and figure out any accurate numbers and report them back to us. Sexual exploitation is often misidentified, like I talked about earlier on with like daddy and boyfriend, and the different ways traffickers, try to bond with their victims and present themselves as someone who is safe and protecting them. A lot of times, trafficking will not be seen for what it is because of things like that. And then finally, other crimes are associated with victims of sexual exploitation. Prostitution itself is illegal in almost all of the United States. And in the handful of places where it isn't, it's got its own, regulations and guidelines that it has to follow. Domestic violence, domestic abuse is often misidentified and associated with survivors of trafficking. And substance use disorders are a huge issue within the world of trafficking, and we'll talk about why in a little bit. So often these other crimes are what gets picked up on, and many of those lead to the victim being the one who is criminalized and not the trafficker. There are some things that we do know, some things we have been able to find out with certainty. So these first 4 here are taken from a study that was done by Loyola University. So survival sex in youth has been found to be a very prevalent form of sex trafficking. So survival sex is another instance of trafficking not really looking like what we think it looks like. So there's not usually, an actual exchange of money in the case of survival sex. Survival sex is when someone needs food for the night, a place to sleep for the night, water, or another basic necessity, and they offer someone sex in exchange for getting those things. 15% of St. Louis homeless youth, mostly 18 to 24, have experienced trafficking. 40% of homeless LGBTQ victims have been, LGBTQ people have been victims of trafficking. And 29% of all sex trafficking victims have been involved in the foster care system at some point. And these next two come from the organizations listed there. So Polaris Project, who runs the National Human Trafficking Hotline, says that more calls, texts, and contacts were made to them in 2019 than any previous year, with 587 coming from Missouri alone. And the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department reported that human trafficking cases grew by 250% between 2015 and 2018. And while those last two statistics, I think, can be very off-putting at first, I and a lot of experts I've talked to do feel that those are more hopeful than they initially appear. That what is more likely than that we've had that drastic an increase in trafficking in that short a period of time is that more people are being educated. Now law enforcement groups are being educated, hospital workers are being educated. There's education in schools and things now, and people are more aware of the signs and more aware of who to call if they see anything. So while those are still very drastic numbers, and that's a lot of trafficking that is going on, I think they point to people being more aware and knowing what to do rather than increasing that quickly. So here we have another small framework that's going to be very important for the rest of the presentation. So in the middle, we have human trafficking and exploitation, which is the main central problem that we as the coalition are trying to address. And then, so starting at the top and going clockwise, we have substance use disorders, domestic violence and sexual violence, homelessness, mental health issues, and the criminal justice system. And you could keep going around, you could keep adding more, but these are the 5 that we think are most important to sort of talk about here. And what's important to note is that these are not things that are coincidentally connected to trafficking. These aren't just happen to be there. These are part of how trafficking operates, how it functions, and how it controls people. And any attempt to address and fix that center problem can't just be, finding someone, quote, rescuing them from their trafficker, and then, saying that the job is done, because these underlying conditions, these problems that uphold and create trafficking are still present. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of those as we talk about identification. So when you identify a potential victim of trafficking, as well as later on when you're working with them, if that's something you do in your position, you're going to need to ask questions. But there are important steps to take and things to do before you ask those questions. So the first thing you should ask is, do I need to know this for my role, for my job? So, someone who identifies a potential case of trafficking and reports that to the hotline needs to know a lot less than a survivor's case manager, who needs to know less than that survivor's trauma therapist. So, in that example, the case manager really only needs to know the information they need to refer this person to the best services possible, while that trauma therapist eventually will need to know a lot of details about that person's trauma history in order to help them. So ask yourself, would knowing the answer to this question help me do my job, do what I need to do? The answer is yes. You ask yourself, do I need to know this right now? So in the trauma therapist example, while eventually they'll need to know a lot of details, a lot of information about that person's past and their trauma history, they don't need to know all that on the first meeting. They don't need to know all that while they're, establishing that therapeutic relationship. So ask yourself, okay, I may need to know this information, but do I need to know it to do my job right now? Or can I do what I need to do without it? And if the answer is yes, you go on to the final question. So is this the right place to ask this question? So there's sort of 2 sides to this. First of all, are we in a place that is, conducive to therapy, to healing, to um, what we need to do? Does this individual feel comfortable here, or as comfortable as they can discussing these issues? Do they have a support system here, and do they have privacy here? And that privacy kind of leads into the second facet, which is, are we in a place where the sensitive information we're talking about could be easily overheard? Are we in a place that allows for this individual to have the privacy they need to talk about these things? So if you go through that sort of checklist, and you need to know this to do your job, you need to know it now, and you're in a place where it is safe to ask that question, that's a question you should be asking, and you should go on with that. Some general indicators, things you might see that point to the fact that an individual might be trafficked. So a trafficked individual may not have access to their personal identification documents, such as an ID or a passport. They also won't be in control of their own money. If they're in a place where they need those things, such as a hospital, they will have, someone with them, the trafficker or someone who works for the trafficker, who gets referred to as their monitor, who talks to the officials, talks to the doctors and the receptionists, handles the money, handles the documents while they stay silent. There may be inconsistencies in their story regarding where they live, how they came to their current location, a lack of knowledge about the city or state they're in. They might claim they're visiting. They're not allowed to contact their family or friends or leave their living or working situation unless someone's monitoring them. You may see signs of abuse, such as physical restraint, confinement, malnourishment, torture, or branding from tattoos or burning. And then there I have hypervigilance, or exhibits a loss of sense of time and space. And that's something important we'll get into in a minute, where when we're dealing with, complex trauma that develops over a long period of time, the symptoms aren't always going to line up from person to person. They won't present the same way. And they may not even present the same way in one person at two different times. So being aware of the ways that trauma can manifest, and that it's not always going to look the same. If you do think that you see something, you've identified a potential survivor, there are important things to do. So the National Human Trafficking Hotline, as I said, operated by Polaris, there's their number, 888-373-7888, or you can text 233-733, be free, as well as contacting local law enforcement. So that's going to be a little different depending on where you are. St. Louis City, for example, does not currently have a human trafficking task force. So that's going to be in their special crimes unit, whereas the county does still have that, and they will have their own number to contact them. And generally, advocate, do what you can to support local organizations that combat trafficking with monetary donations, with volunteer hours, whatever you can do, whatever time you have. If that's just, following them on social media and spreading their message when you see it, getting that information out there. But there do exist a lot of barriers to identification, a lot of things that make identification difficult. So there are a lot of different biases and things that go into trafficking. Racial biases play a huge part. We do know, we've seen it happen, and it's statistically backed up, that if law enforcement are to encounter a white woman who is being trafficked, it's a lot more likely that she will be properly identified as a survivor and referred to services that can help her than a woman of color, especially Black women, who are much more likely to be criminalized for prostitution or substance use or one of these co-occurring issues. There's also an oversimplification of the realities of trafficking and what it looks like and how it operates. A lot of people don't understand how drug and alcohol abuse are connected to trafficking, and they don't understand complex trauma and how it works and how it's different than how we typically understand PTSD. So we will talk about some of that. So substance use disorders, we typically see developing in three different ways in survivors of trafficking. So it's used as a tool of recruitment where a trafficker will target an individual who already has an existing substance use disorder. They will become that individual supplier and rack up that debt that I talked about, that debt that they leverage to bring that person into them. Once under the control of the trafficker, it's used as a system of control, where if an individual is regularly meeting their quota, doing what is expected of them by their trafficker, they will be given a supply of substances as a reward for that. And if they can't meet that quota or they're acting out against their trafficker, they'll be denied those substances. And having to experience that withdrawal and those symptoms of withdrawal is their punishment for not doing what's expected of them, and they need to conform to the expectations if they want to be given those substances again. And then sort of separately from those two, we do see it develop as a form of a coping mechanism where an individual will begin to use substances as a response to the trauma of their victimization and as a way to get through that. Complex PTSD it's a relatively new idea. So you see there, one of the first studies in 1997. Complex PTSD is currently not an official diagnosis in the DSM, but there are people working for that. But here in Herman's study, he says complex trauma generally involves some form of captivity, whether physical or emotional. And here we're mostly talking about emotional captivity. We're not usually going to see a lot of signs of physical restraint. When we hear about trafficking and kidnapping, some people associate images like chains or bars or physical restraints along those lines. Often the captivity that these individuals are placed in is manipulative, it's emotional and psychological. And another important fact with complex PTSD, it's stretched out over a long period of time. While PTSD often develops from one or two major traumatic events, complex PTSD is extended reoccurring trauma over a longer period of time. And there are a lot of difficulties that sort of differentiate it from our understanding of typical post-traumatic stress disorder. So those suffering from complex PTSD will have increased difficulty with emotional regulation, difficulty maintaining and controlling their own consciousness, distorted self-perception, and a distorted perception of the perpetrator. So as I've said, often they will see their trafficker, their abuser, as a protector and provider who kept them safe. And that image will sort of be reflected onto themselves, and they will see themselves as broken or damaged or dirty or other words that we don't like to use as a result of what happened to them and what they were forced to do. Difficulty in relations with others, a lot of difficulty developing new relationships. And there at the bottom, we have one system of meanings, which is just in reference to the way they generally understand the world around them. The people and the things around them in the world is changed. It is distorted by what they've been through. Some other common symptoms that we see that get reported by survivors, and this is getting back to what I said about how when we're dealing with complex trauma, the symptoms aren't always going to match up. They may seem contradictory at times, and it's important to understand all of the different ways it can manifest. So avoidance, disorientation, anxiety, panic attacks, memory loss, difficulty concentrating, anger, aggression, mood changes, exhaustion and fatigue, isolating themselves, a fear of being alone, but that's coupled with a distrust of strangers, presenting hallucinations or delusions, somaticization, feeling symptoms that aren't actually physically occurring to them. Trauma bonds and attachment, often attachment to their trafficker. And we've seen, several reports of general feelings of emotional numbness. The criminalization of survivors is also a huge issue. And here you'll kind of see it as a system that reinforces itself. So adult women who are experiencing trafficking typically were trafficked first in their youth as children. However, adult victims, once they're at that point, are a lot more likely to be charged with related offenses than they are to be correctly identified as a survivor and offered services. Once that criminal record is in place, it puts a limit on the available resources they have for leaving the life. And in addition to that, federal money for sex trafficking cannot be used to target the Johns, the buyers who are the ones, putting money into the system and driving up demand in this market. And that, coupled with the different ways traffickers protect themselves, hide themselves, a lot of that money often goes into criminalizing the people that it is said to protect. So briefly earlier, I discussed bottoms. So nearly 1 in 3 pimps say that they delegate management responsibilities to a bottom or the most experienced employee. Sometimes we see bottoms sort of moving from being exploited to becoming a partner in the business, but that is rare. But it does a few things, as I've kind of alluded to. It lets the trafficker, put all of that work off on someone else, which gives them less to do and allows them to separate themselves, make themselves harder to find. And it also pits their victims against one another. They're working for this position of relative ease, of relative access, instead of, working together to better their situation. So a couple quotes from traffickers regarding this. You want a bottom girl who runs everything while you're out of town, knows how to do everything a pimp do. Once you get a bottom girl, it becomes automatic. And these girls, they don't get a cut or anything, but they do get anything they want or need. The reason you don't give them their own money, they would be like, I can just keep this. So it is still control being placed on this individual. This individual is still being exploited, but part of that exploitation is to set them above everyone else and make them in charge of everyone else. Here we have Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is a framework from psychology. So the idea is, on the bottom, we have our physiological needs: food, shelter, clothing, etc. And it's not until we have, a stable, firm foundation in those things that we can work on the next thing, safety and security. And not until we have that stable, firm foundation there, we can go to love and belonging, then to self-esteem, then to self-actualization. So the fulfilled goals, reached potential, whatever that is for the individual. And what traffickers will do, part of how traffickers operate, is very much zeroing in on these first two, on the physiological needs that the person needs and their feelings of safety and security. And they will become the only person who can provide these things. And because of that, they can take them away at a moment's notice. So because they, become these things and they don't provide a stable, firm grounding in those things, it prevents their victims from really moving up past this and working on those next steps to reach a point where maybe they could help themselves. So finally, as I said, we're going to talk about what working with the survivor looks like, some best practices for talking with the survivor, working with the survivor, whatever, capacity you do that in your position. So on your first interaction with a victim, there are some things to avoid. You don't want to ask them to leave the life if you know you can't help them to find housing. We talked about all those interconnected issues, and homelessness was one of them. Asking a person to leave their trafficker, who is still, a place to sleep and a source of food and shelter, before you can give them something else to start building that in, just recreates the situations that often led them to trafficking in the first place. Don't promise anything that you cannot provide. Don't say what's wrong or trust me or ask why questions. That trust between you and the survivor is something that needs to be built up over time. It can't be something that's expected to be there. These individuals have no reason to trust you before you prove that to them. You're there to help and that you have the best of intentions, but they don't have a way to know that. These next four, so don't try to convince them that they're victims. Don't ask about their trauma on the first interaction. Don't ask directly about their trafficker, and don't talk negatively about their trafficker for reasons that we've kind of gone into at this point. But, generally at this stage, what we're talking about is avoiding triggering this individual, avoiding triggering re-traumatization of this individual. And realizations like that they are the victims of the crime, like that their trafficker was not a protector and provider, but someone who exploited and hurt them. Those are realizations that they need to come to in their own time through their healing process. And trying to get them to realize those things before they are ready is, in the best case scenario, going to cause them to pull back from your help and what you're trying to provide. And in the worst case scenario, that is going to be a trauma trigger for them. Don't verbalize your assumptions. Keep those to yourself. Remember that you're a stranger to them. They have no reason to believe what you say, to trust you, or even to talk to you. Most of the time, every person they've met has exploited, abused, or shunned them in some way. Some good things to do. You want to make sure basic needs are met before you ask them for anything. Simple things is, do you want a glass of water? Do you know where the bathroom in the building is? Simple things go a long way. Check all of your biases at the door. Use plain language, as social workers or medical workers or any position that you could have that can interact with survivors of trafficking. There's a lot of, jargon, words that are used and understood by people in the profession. And trafficking survivors aren't going to know all of those words, all of those terms. Use plain language, talk to them in a way they can understand, but you're also not talking down to them. They're capable of understanding what you're talking about. It's just being aware of the word choice that you're using there. Explain why, ask permission, and respect the answer that you're given. This is true of anything you could ask a survivor for, but it's especially important when we're talking about reporting or taking notes on your time with them or physically touching them in any way. Clearly explain confidentiality and how it works. If they share something with you that you do need to tell someone else, explain that to them. Explain why that is and how that works. That may still hurt the trust that you're trying to build with them, but that's an easier place to come back from than, taking something they thought they told you in confidence, letting them continue to believe that, and going behind their back and telling someone. Notice who's around you while you're asking questions or giving them resources. You're only going to give them physical resources, hotline numbers, outreach cards, things like that, if they are alone. Because while that monitor, the person who is monitoring them, may be obvious if they're in a place where they need to spend money, use their ID, out in public, that's going to be less obvious, and you don't know necessarily who that person is. A few quick reminders. Most victims who are pimp controlled have been trained on how to answer questions from law enforcement or social service providers. They know how to give you as little information as possible and get out. If they do think they can trust you, they may give you small bits of information, and that's still going to be small bits of information related to their trauma history. And you have to be aware of your reaction during that time. You can't overreact. You can't act like you just heard the worst thing in the world, even if to you that may be true, because you have to present yourself as someone trustworthy, as someone who this can be shared with. Keep in mind that many victims don't identify as human trafficking victims due to both a lack of knowledge about the crime and the power and control dynamics that are used in trafficking situations. And finally, there, establishing physical and psychological safety is a prerequisite in working with trafficking victims who have trauma history. So how might we unintentionally, in completely well-meaning ways, cause those we serve to relive their trauma? How might well-meaning actions trigger the individuals we want to help? So in our general interactions, we want to avoid anything that could come off as humiliating, impersonal, harsh, critical, demanding, or judgmental. We want to express kindness, patience, calm, listening in all of our interactions with survivors. Frequent use of please and thank you whenever that is a relevant thing to insert into the conversation. We don't want to ask questions that convey the idea that there's something wrong with that person. Instead, we want our questions to help us understand what harmful events from their past may be contributing to the problems they're facing now. We don't want to regard the difficulties they're facing as a symptom of mental health and only that, or as a substance use issue, or as just a medical problem. Rather, we want to recognize that the symptoms they're facing may be a part of the way of coping to their trauma. They may be adaptations to living in their trafficking situation with their trafficker. Generally, we want to focus on the person's safety and needs. We're not going to second guess decisions that the individuals made or are making while they're in the life. They are the expert on their experience. They are the expert on how to survive living with their trafficker. And those decisions are directly linked to that survival and self-preservation. And it's not our job to judge what they should have done there. Use strengths-based and supportive language. And finally, don't give up. And don't giving up can be difficult sometimes. There's a lot of risk of survivor reentry. So individuals may exit the life for a short period, receive some services, but then ultimately reenter. This is actually likely, individuals are likely to return an average of 7 times before it finally sticks and they are able to leave the life. The main reason we see this in women is financial insecurity. There's very, very few statistics on male survivors of trafficking because there are less of them. But I would imagine it's similar there, that financial insecurity is part of the reason. But there's also more general reasons. These individuals are caught between old and new patterns, ideas, and people at the same time as they're trying to heal themselves and completely change their life. And that's not an easy thing. So finally, we're going to come back to this framework for a minute. We've got to address all of the individual's needs. Rescuing someone from their trafficker is not the final step. It does not solve the problem. But what we're not saying here is, that one organization, one group of individuals needs to be able to fix all of these problems and solve everything. That's part of why we have, the coalition, why we have CATE, so that these different organizations across the state of Missouri can share resources, share ideas, and try and combat trafficking as a united front. Are there any questions?